Good afternoon, and thank you for joining. My name is Jaro Miziak, and I'm delighted to moderate this webinar. Let me first introduce our distinguished speaker of today, Professor Nicholas Hanley is Chair in Environmental and One Health Economics at the University of Glasgow. His previous affiliation were with University of Stirling, Edinburgh, and St Andrews. He's a distinguished expert in environmental economics, specialized in biodiversity conservation, choice modeling, cost-benefit analysis, marine system, and design of environmental policies, including payment for ecosystem services, which is also the topic of today's webinar. This webinar is organized by Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, which is the largest research institute in Italy, dedicated to all aspects of climate change. It's a multidisciplinary research center looking into climate modeling, impact modeling, economic modeling, and many more. So the main aim of CMCC is to analyze interaction of climate system with society and environment, to guarantee reliable, rigorous, and timely scientific results to stimulate sustainable growth and protect the environment. The webinar is also co-organized by BioEcon, which stands for Biodiversity and Economics for Conservation, which is an interdisciplinary network aiming to advance economic theory and policy for biodiversity conservation. It gathers together economists, lawyers, and scientists from leading international academic and research institutions and main policy organizations working with design and implementation of cutting-edge economic incentive for biodiversity protection. Without further delaying, I will pass the floor to our speaker. I have only some practical information for you. You might post your questions in the dedicated section, which you see on your right side panel. When you post a question, please introduce also your name and your affiliation so that the question becomes a little bit personal. And please be informed that this webinar is being recorded and will be available from our YouTube channel within a few days, as well as the slide in PDF forms. So thank you very much again for attending, and Nick, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, and I hope you can all hear me. As Jaroslav says, my name's Nick Hanley, and I'm now at the University of Glasgow in the Institute of Biodiversity, Animal Health and Comparative Medicine. And this presentation is all about trying to use economics to improve the design of payment for ecosystem services. So I assume that most people tuning in will know what a PES scheme is, but in case you don't, a PES scheme is defined as a scheme where some buyer, and it's typically the government, offers payments to landowners and land managers to undertake some actions which will then supply an increase in desirable ecosystem services like flood control, for example, or in biodiversity conservation. And why do we need these PES schemes? It's all about market failure in the delivery of these environmental goods. Crucially, we need to recognize that the decision of an individual landowner to opt in to one of these schemes is voluntary, so nobody has to join the scheme. And as I said at the beginning, typically the institution paying for these actions is the government, but there are many exceptions, so water companies or environmental NGOs. Now, as economists, we can recognize that there are many design problems associated with setting up a PES scheme. We have PES schemes now in operation all over the world to counter many different environmental problems, but as economists, we could recognize that there are a number of design issues. I guess the one that most economists have thought about is cost effectiveness. Given that our budgets are limited, how do we set up a PES scheme which maximizes environmental gains for a given budget. But there are a number of other interesting problems. One is how to ensure that we get additional environmental benefits, not just environmental benefits that would have been provided in any case without payment. How to ensure compliance, given that it may be costly, very costly, to monitor those individuals who join the scheme. That we might want to spatially target our payments in the sense that some areas of land will likely deliver higher environmental benefits than other areas of land. And then finally, something which not so many people think about is the evaluation of scheme performance. So what were the net costs and benefits of implementing the scheme? And we have to address all these design problems in a context where landowners know a lot more about the costs of supply than the buyer does, and where we have hundreds or possibly thousands of potential suppliers who might participate in the scheme. So in this seminar, I wanted to look briefly at 4 options, not 5 as previously advertised, but 4 options for improving the design of PES schemes. And I just list them here. So the first idea is all around spatial conservation, spatial coordination. The second idea is around getting groups of individuals to participate rather than individuals by themselves. The third idea is around behavioural mechanisms, both to encourage participation, but also to improve performance. And then finally, there's the issue of whether we should pay for environmental outcomes rather than for management action. So in what follows, I'm just going to run through each of these 4 options, and I'm mainly going to refer to work that I've been doing with some colleagues over the last few years on these 4 ideas, but I will try and put this in the context of what's out there already. So the first issue is around spatial coordination. So I think it's pretty well known now that many environmental benefits that we might want to achieve through a PES scheme are likely to be enhanced if we can somehow spatially coordinate participation. So examples would include restoring wetlands, or reintroducing species, or increasing populations of wild insect pollinators like bees, or indeed something we've looked at recently, controlling invasive species. But clearly, if we're relying on individual landowners to decide for themselves whether they want to join in the scheme, there's an interesting question about how do we design incentives so that people will decide to join in a spatially coordinated way. And economics has really come up with 2 ideas that I'm aware of how to do that. And the first idea is most widely known as the agglomeration bonus, and I'll say a little bit about that. And the second idea is around spatially connected auctions. So what's the agglomeration bonus? It's a 2-part payment scheme originally proposed many years ago now by Jay Sjogren and Greg Parkhurst with co-authors. And essentially, the 2 parts of the payment are a participation payment, which everybody gets, but also an agglomeration bonus, which people only get if their neighbor or other neighbors join the scheme as well. And clearly what that does is it creates a coordination game where my payoffs from deciding whether to participate or not also depend on the actions of my neighbors, because if my neighbors also participate, then I may get a higher benefit. And in that coordination game, we typically find there are multiple Nash equilibria, which we can usually Pareto rank. And in most of the experiments that we've run, we see that there's a risk dominant equilibrium and a payoff dominant equilibrium. We'd like farmers to converge on the payoff dominant equilibrium, because that's the one that maximizes net social benefit, but typically what happens is they don't. They coordinate on the risk dominant equilibrium, and what that means is we end up with coordination failure. Now, actually, there's been a lot of work done, mostly in the lab, but also a little bit with simulation, to try and answer the question, well, what factors underlie the performance of this agglomeration bonus if we want to achieve spatial coordination? And so some of the findings from that literature are that, first of all, information matters. So what I know about my neighbor's choices seems to be important. The transactions costs of participating seem to be important. Opportunities to communicate with my neighbors are important. And the size of the network. How many players are there on the landscape that are playing this coordination game? So all those things seem to matter, but one tendency that we do observe is that over time, the performance of the agglomeration bonus seems to get worse. Because of strategic uncertainty, people start to converge more and more on the risk dominant outcome, and we don't get the kinds of spatial coordination that we wanted. Now, that's not to say that this is a depressing conclusion, because many studies have shown that the agglomeration can produce desirable levels of spatial coordination. What's lacking, of course, is actual trials of this mechanism in the field. There are a few examples, but very few. One alternative, which we've just started to investigate, is to think about choice modeling with landowners as a way of predicting how well the agglomeration bonus might work in practice. And I've included a reference there to some recent work that we've done, which people might like to look at if they're interested in that approach. So the alternative idea is one of spatially connecting auctions. And the idea of conservation auctions as a way of allocating PES contracts has been around for a long time now, going back to the work of Uwe Latache-Lohmann. And one thing that economists like about conservation auctions clearly is that they seem to be relatively cost effective. But if we actually want to use auctions as a way of encouraging spatial coordination, then what we have to do is somehow reward bids more from neighboring landowners, or move them up the ranking. And there are a number of studies which show that you can devise a bid scoring scheme which will produce desired patterns of spatial conservation on a landscape. And the original and in some senses still the best example of this is the paper by Windle and John Rolfe and colleagues in 2009 for Queensland in Australia. But there's been a lot of studies now, including some simulation work. And what do we learn? Well, what we learn is that communication is important in terms of the performance of spatially connected auctions between farmers. But of course, that runs the risk of increasing rent seeking and reducing competition. What we also learn, which comes out again in the general literature on conservation auctions, is that the auction design is crucial. So is this a multi-round versus a single round? Is it discriminating price versus uniform price? What exactly is the way in which we spatially weight bids to produce the desired pattern of spatial coordination? So that's the first issue that I wanted to talk about, spatial coordination. The second issue I wanted to talk about was the idea of encouraging groups of land managers to participate together rather than focusing on the decisions of individuals. And we got interested in this because there are now examples in the real world of these group-based schemes. So in the Netherlands and in the UK, in agri-environmental policies, there's a tendency to reward or restrict the participation of some schemes to groups of farmers rather than individuals. So why would we want to encourage groups to bid together or to join together to deliver some conservation outcome? Well, one might be to do with enhancing cost effectiveness. in the sense that a group of farmers together could figure out how to more cost effectively provide an environmental outcome than if they operate individually. Another idea would be in terms of improving environmental delivery. So maybe for some kinds of environmental improvement, let's say like reducing non-point pollution in particular hotspots, it might be better to get groups of individuals to participate rather than having each individual making a separate participation decision. But of course, there are problems in moving towards a focus on groups. Depending on policy design, it might reduce competition, might increase rent seeking. But it's something that would be interesting to look at. And in some work that I've been doing with Semanti Banerjee and Tim Cason and Frans de Vries, which we presented recently in Gothenburg at the World Congress, we tried to look at whether this group-based participation would work in the setting of a conservation auction. So what we did there was we ran some experiments where farmers were linked together on a circular network, and they could choose to submit joint bids into the conservation auction rather than individual bids, although the option to submit an individual bid always remained. And what we actually found there was kind of surprising. We found that for any targeted spatial configuration, joint bidding actually seemed to reduce cost effectiveness. However, repeated interactions between our players led to improved cost efficiency. And one conclusion that we drew was that the outcome of any group-based participation scheme seems to depend crucially on how the buyer, so that's the government in this context, chooses to reward joint action relative to individual action. And that might sound obvious, but it wasn't something that we were expecting to see. So that's one take on, is it a good idea to encourage group-based participation? A rather different angle on this is where the group action determines the payment that individuals get. So what we're now thinking of is a situation where individual farmers decide whether to join the scheme or not, but they know that their payoff will depend on how many farmers in total enroll. And so, for example, you could imagine a scheme where farmers are told if at least, let's say, 50% of other farmers in your catchment enroll, you will get a bonus. And interestingly, some work I did with Laura Kufus and her colleagues in Montpellier showed that this kind of incentive seems to be pretty cost effective in increasing participation. So let me just tell you a little bit about the work that Laura did there. So she was looking at the idea of a bonus which was linked to how many farmers within a catchment or within a local area decided to join the scheme. And the particular context was wine growers in the south of France, particularly in terms of their use of pesticides, where we're trying to encourage participation. And a choice experiment was used to look at how farmers would vary in terms of their willingness to join the scheme as we vary how strict the reduction in pesticide use has to be, but also whether a bonus is offered if at least 50%, in our case, of farmers join. So it was an internet survey. We have 317 responses. This is an example of the choice card that our wine growers completed. And if I just move quickly to some results, this paper is published in the European Review of Agricultural Economics. This bonus significantly increases farmers' decisions to participate, so that's not very surprising. But what's more interesting is that when we did some simulations comparing how effective would it be to put an extra 30 euros into the uniform payment that everybody gets irrespective of how many people join versus putting 30 euros into this bonus if at least 50% of farmers joined, we found that the group-based payment had a much bigger effect on stated willingness to enroll in the scheme. And that wasn't something that we were expecting to see. So obviously the question is, well, why should that be? And we could think of two reasons why that might be. One is that, of course, farmers might be motivated by a desire to conform to the behavior of most of their neighbors. So maybe a collective payment scheme works through this desire to conform to majority behavior. Or maybe it's because farmers actually care about the environmental improvement that comes from implementing the scheme. And they know that this environmental improvement will only happen if enough farmers participate, if enough farmers reduce pesticide use, for example, in the catchment. And so maybe that's what's driving farmers' behavior in that scheme. So there we've looked at two ways in which we could link the behavior of the group to the outcome of a PES scheme. And in the third issue I wanted to look at, I'm going to come back to this idea of the behavior of the group, because what I want to look at under this third heading is the idea of behavioral mechanisms to encourage participation. So I guess everyone's doing this behavioral economics stuff right now. There's nothing particularly original about applying it to the context of PES design. But we do come across some interesting results. So just to be clear, first of all, what I mean by a behavioral mechanism. What I mean is a policy which produces a change in the context of people's decisions without changing the prices they face or changing the regulation on their activities. And in the more general literature, that kind of mechanism is more widely known as a nudge. So it's some change in the context of a decision, changing what you understand other people will do, or changing what you think you should do, or changing the default, or changing the framing of the choice problem. So it's a non-monetary, non-binding policy option. And in the next few slides, I just want to focus on one particular kind of nudge, which is a social norm. So as many of you will know, there's lots of empirical evidence now that consumers are sometimes positively influenced by nudges. And so, the best known examples relate to household electricity use, household water use, household recycling behavior, that if we provide a nudge, for example, in terms of a social norm, then that can reduce households' electricity use or water use or increase their recycling behavior, typically by a relatively small amount, but in the direction that we're hoping to move things. But what about nudges in the context of PES schemes? So again, some work that I've been doing with colleagues in Montpellier, we looked at the effect of a pure nudge on farmers' intentions to participate in PES schemes. And in particular, we looked at their intention to carry on with what we might call green farming at the end of the PES contract. So for many years now, people have known that there is this end of contract problem, which is that when we stop paying farmers or foresters for environmental benefits, maybe they stop delivering these benefits. But the empirical evidence is that that reversal does not completely happen. Many farmers do seem to maintain greener farming practices, even once payments stop. And so clearly there's a question there about, well, why would this be? And one issue would be, well, maybe these greener farmer practices don't actually cost them anything, and even though they maybe thought originally that there would be cost to these schemes, or it may be that these greener farming practices produce benefits that the farmers had not appreciated before. So again, with Laura Kufus and colleagues, we looked at the effects of such a nudge on farmer behavior. And so in this paper in Land Economics, we looked at the effect of a social norm as a particular kind of nudge on farmers' intentions to maintain their green practices once payments stop. So the design of the experiment is very simple. It was an online survey of farmers currently participating in a particular PES scheme in France. We had a split sample design, so farmers were in one of 3 subsamples. And in the first subsample, the control group, we just asked farmers whether they would plan to maintain these pro-environmental changes without renewing of their PES contract. And then we have 2 what you might call nudge treatments. So in the first nudge treatment, we positively frame information and we say to farmers, in a previous survey, 80% of respondents stated they would maintain greener farmer practices after the payments ended. Will you do it? And then in group 2, with negatively framed information, we just switch that around and say in a previous survey, 20% of respondents stated they would not maintain changes without renewing the contract. So the question is there an effect of the nudge, and does the effect depend on how we frame the information? And just very simply, what we found was that yes, there was an effect of the nudge. So giving farmers information on what other farmers said they would do after the end of the contract certainly significantly changed their stated intention to carry on with greener farmer practices, but we did not find any framing effect. Which leads us on to thinking about whether nudges could be used more broadly to reinforce payment-based schemes within PES design. And again, at the World Congress in Gothenburg last month, we presented some new evidence on this, where we think about having a nudge which affects the agglomeration bonus. And so without going into too much detail, we set up a lab experiment where farmers have 2 alternatives for their land. They can choose an environmental land use X, or they can use a sort of conventional agricultural land use Y, which produces no environmental goods. And then we were interested in whether we could use a nudge to change the effectiveness of the agglomeration bonus in either the number of players choosing X, this pro-environmental land use, or in terms of spatial coordination. So one feature of our setup here is that we try to mimic the non-pecuniary motives of farmers in signing up for a scheme by essentially linking their choices of X to actual donations to an environmental charity. And what that also did was give us a way of generating a social norm in the lab, which essentially was how much did your group donate relative to other groups. So the setup is payoffs from either choosing X or Y. Those payoffs from choosing X, also, which is the pro-environmental land use, also depend on how many of your neighbors choose X, but your utility might depend not just on your payoffs, but also on the level of the environmental good that's generated, E. So, and that's mimicked by this donation. So I won't go through the detail, but you can read it on the World Congress website if you're interested. We again have subjects on a circular network. We have them in groups, and the groups are what we use to generate this nudge, which is their ranking. So essentially, how much does your group contribute to the environmental good relative to other groups? We have essentially 4 versions of the experiment where we have a no agglomeration bonus and no nudge, only an agglomeration bonus, only a nudge, or an agglomeration bonus and a nudge. And if I look at some results, what we found actually was that the nudge did not significantly increase the effectiveness of the agglomeration bonus, and the nudge on its own could not replace the agglomeration bonus. And if you look at just some simple results on efficiency, it's really only by paying that we get close to the maximum possible efficiency in terms of spatial coordination. So what we found in this experiment was that there was there was little to no effect of the nudge on participation or on spatial coordination. And in fact, if you read the detail in the paper, the nudge could actually make things worse, possibly by crowding out non-pecuniary motives, which the nudge relies on for its effectiveness. So that was a slightly depressing conclusion. Okay, just briefly to finish with, the idea of paying for outcomes, not actions. So, what does the buyer care about in PES schemes along with the cost? Well, what the buyer cares about is the environmental outcome itself. And yet most PES schemes across the world don't pay for environmental outcomes, they pay for actions. So they pay for creating better bird habitat rather than paying for more birds. And the obvious question is this a mistake? Now, of course, there are some examples of paying for outcome schemes, some conservation schemes in Australia, bird conservation schemes for grassland in parts of Germany, a new scheme just interested in England by the National Trust for their farmers. And you could have a design which mixes paying for actions with paying for outcomes. But why would we want to pay for outcomes? Well, you could say, first of all, that if we redesigned a PES scheme so that what we pay for is actual environmental outcomes, farmers can use their local knowledge to decide how best to produce those target environmental outcomes. Secondly, those environmental outcomes might be less costly for the regulator to observe than monitoring actions. Paying for outcomes could also induce farmers to engage in costly to measure conservation effort and could induce environmentally friendly dynamic innovation in land management. And finally, we're paying for what we want, which is environmental outcomes. So clearly against those advantages, we could set some disadvantages. And the big one really is about risk. So if we pay for outcomes, then for the farmer, there's an increase in the risk of non-delivery, since many of the variables determining the environmental outcome are not within her direct control. So what that means is we will predict that participation will be lower. And then for the regulator, some of the environmental outcomes may be harder to monitor at the individual farm level than actions. And I also wonder about this idea of the WTO insisting on only paying for the opportunity costs of providing environmental benefits within agricultural policies. So if we pay for outcomes, then now we've basically moved away from that. We could just say, well, now we're going to pay instead on the basis of what people are willing to pay for these environmental benefits. So in terms of some conclusions on paying for environmental outcomes rather than for actions, there are some theoretical results out there which give us general conditions under which an outcome-based payment scheme is preferable. But we're probably still not much further on than the paper by Burton and Schwartz concluded in 2013. And just to read out what they said, despite growing pressure in government circles for rapid change, we contend it would be a mistake to jump into result-orientated provision without making a major attempt to understand exactly what is required for success and what the long-term environmental, economic, and social outcomes are likely to be. And my contention is that we haven't really understood those long-term environmental, economic, and social outcomes for paying for outputs. So, just to finish, I've looked at 4 issues which offer some improvements, I think, in the design of PES schemes relative to what you might call a standard model, which is that we offer a uniform payment and we don't really worry too much about environmental additionality. I think we could all agree that we can improve on that standard model. The 4 issues I've looked at, so that's spatial coordination, participation by groups rather than individuals, using behavioral mechanisms, and thinking about paying for outcomes rather than actions. These are just 4 of the issues that economists have raised in terms of improving the design of PES schemes. So that's my take on the issue. Your questions are very welcome, and I think I need to now pass back the chair and go to your questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this really interesting talk. I'd like to remind all the attendees, please post your question, if any, to the dashboard, and if possible, just write down your name and affiliation. For Nick, we had something around 180, 190 attendees, which is excellent for this. It's one of the most attended webinars we have. So we have the first question, but I see only the name, but not the question itself. Right. So probably it's coming. So while we are waiting, yes, there is one question from Silvia Santato from CMCC. She says, thank you for your interesting presentation, Nick. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the importance of transaction cost. Are you accounting for transaction cost in your research? And if yes, how are you collecting the information for the different categories and designs? And second part of the question is there any study that measures transaction cost for payment for ecosystem services that consider both ex ante and ex post transaction cost?
Okay, that's a great question. So you're right, most studies don't think about transactions costs. There are a few empirical studies that have tried to estimate those, mainly for agri-environment schemes. So our paper on transactions costs, which is the lead author is Semanti Banerjee, that came out in GEAM in 2017, I think it was. So in that paper, we do survey what we know from the empirical literature on estimates of transactions costs. But in our experiment that we describe in that paper, we essentially introduce a transaction cost which is related to the rules of the lab experiment, which is essentially that if you want to join the PES scheme, you have to pay a fixed fee. And then what we do is we vary that fixed fee from high to low, and we see what effect that has on participation and on spatial coordination.
Thank you. We have another question from Stuart Witten from CSI Row in Australia. And the question is, one of the challenges is institutional readiness to trial these novel types of policy mechanism. Do you have any reflection on your collaborations in encouraging innovation by agencies, and what make them ready to try something new?
That's a great question, Stuart. Well, I think Australia is a great example of innovation if we think about the use of conservation auctions. But if I think about an institutional context that I know more about, which is the UK and Europe, then what makes innovation more likely? I think one factor you would have to point to would be the role of the ideas entrepreneur. So moving away briefly from a PES context to a more general economic instruments and environmental policy context, I think there's quite a few papers out there which discuss the role of this ideas entrepreneur in the uptake of cap and trade, or in environmental taxes on, for example, landfill. And this ideas entrepreneur is someone who essentially brokers between the academic community who come up with the ideas and the regulatory and policy community who are looking for solutions to problems. But some of those papers also point out that these solutions are most likely to be taken up when there's some kind of perceived crisis in the policy environment. So when the current approach is clearly not working, and I think you could think about the uptake of cap and trade in sulfur trading, in acid rain trading in the US under the Clean Air Act in the early 1990s is a great example of that.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Another question from Ina Porras from IIED. Thanks, Nick, for this succinct presentation. What lessons do you have from developing countries' context on using these strategies to improve PES designs?
Well, thank you, Ina. So most of my empirical evidence that I've talked about here has come exclusively from a developed country context. So I'm poorly qualified to answer your question, but I don't think I would see any conceptual differences in what ought to improve matters in terms of these four ideas that we looked at. Clearly, what is different is, number one, institutional capability for monitoring and enforcing more complex schemes. That may vary between developed and less developed nations. A second issue would clearly be around differences in the clarity of property rights. So we know that, if we think about farmers in France, it's very clear who owns the land and who has the right to do what on land. But that may be much less clear if we switch the context to Bolivia. So I think that would be an additional area of concern in terms of transferability of ideas. And then the final one would be, well, what's the actual objective of the PES scheme anyway? Is it just about environmental benefits per dollar, or is it also about poverty reduction? And if it's also about poverty reduction, then clearly everything I have said is less useful, because I've really just thought about environmental cost effectiveness. I haven't thought about how good such schemes are at reducing poverty.
We have a connected question from Rod Keenan, University of Melbourne, and he asks, how might social equity be factored into these PES designs?
Well, in our experiments, absolutely none. If I look at more broadly at some of the PES schemes that we've looked at amongst farmers in the UK, then there is certainly a concern for making schemes available to all or accessible to all. This clearly links back to the issue about whether PES schemes are just there to produce environmental benefits, or whether they are also there to generate additional income. And certainly some of our work in the Peak District in England showed that PES payments could be up to 70% of income to farmers in our study areas. So clearly those schemes are not there just to generate environmental benefits in a cost-effective way. And yet, with many exceptions, that's essentially how economists think about the problem, which obviously is slightly unsatisfactory.
Thank you. We have one comment, rather uncommon, but I'd like to turn it also into a question from Sheila Zamora Lopez, University of Hamburg. She says, thanks for these useful points remarked in PES design. What approach do you suggest will be more feasible with RED Plus schemes in South countries, taking into account that now RED Plus should deliver multi-objectives? Would you have some thoughts about how transferable your result would be on the RED Plus scheme?
To be honest, no. I know absolutely nothing about RED Plus schemes, so I'm not going to pretend that I do. I mean, I could say a little bit about whether, if you have multiple objectives for the PES scheme, multiple environmental objectives, then we learn anything from the research I've reviewed. I don't think in particular having multiple environmental objectives destroys any of the four ideas that we talked about, but it clearly makes it a heck of a lot more complicated to implement. So if you're thinking about paying for outcomes, or if you're thinking about spatially targeted auctions, then saying that we don't just have one environmental benefit that we're trying to maximize subject to the budget constraint, but we have two or three, so not just breeding bird numbers, but also flood risks and carbon sequestration, then that clearly makes designing a cost-effective mechanism much more difficult. But I won't pretend I know anything about REDD+, because I don't.
Thank you for that. We have one question from Mamadou Gouye from CEEM. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering about the implementation of the payment for outcomes. And Mamadou is apparently concerned about the limits of the application. His point is that it can bear significant issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at those two theory papers that I mentioned, or if you think about the few examples of actual payment for outcome schemes, the critical assumption is how costly is it to measure the environmental outcome of interest relative to the management action that generates that environmental outcome. So for payment for outcome schemes to work, we clearly have to have some environmental outcome that's relatively low cost to measure, and where, if it's the case, we can only measure it at the catchment level or the landscape level rather than at the individual farm level, does that matter? So for example, in the scheme in Germany, which I'm aware of, there's use of essentially volunteer labor to implement the monitoring scheme, and the monitoring scheme is implemented at the individual farm level, but it's hard to think about that being a generalizable rollout procedure. For example, if we thought about pesticide use linked to water quality, would that be a feasible mechanism? I think it's much harder to think about that as a feasible mechanism. We'd have to say, okay, well, the environmental outcome is going to have to relate to some catchment level measure of water quality. And then we have to ask the question, well, how do we incentivize individual behavior based on a catchment level outcome? And obviously there's a big literature on ambient-based non-point source pollution taxes going back to Kathleen Segerson, but how that exactly applies to the rollout of PES is not something I've seen developed.
Thank you. Another question comes from Katrin Heeren from Browning Environment. Hi Nick, very interesting presentation. Could you please elaborate a bit more on the behavioral mechanism, more precisely on the motivation for farmers to change their behavior? How do you mainstream environmental friendly land management? How do you make it more attractive for conventional land uses? What are the main motivators? Thank you.
Okay, so I think that brings in two issues there. So one is, why do producers respond to behavioral mechanisms? And the second issue is, what is it in general that motivates land managers' decisions? So if I take the second part first, which would be to say, if we were trying to understand why do some farmers or foresters enroll in a PES scheme and others do not, how can we explain that? Well, you know, typically most of our models say they compare the expected income under the two scenarios, the expected profit rather, under two scenarios. But what we know is that that's not a very complete explanation. So we'd also want to take into account what I think I refer to as non-pecuniary motives. So that would be where, for example, the farmer cares about the opinion his neighbors have of his behavior, or where the farmer cares about the actual environmental outcome itself. And that could be the environmental outcome on her farm, or it could be the environmental outcome more generally. And knowing which of those is most important in any context is clearly very vital. And we do have some ways of trying to measure that, but I don't think we can generalize other than to say it's very unlikely that all farmers care about is profit. The second issue that you ask about is then, well, how does the behavioral mechanism work? And that really depends on, well, what is it that motivates decisions? Because clearly, if I don't care at all about what my neighbors think of me, then why would a nudge be effective in changing my behavior? So the two issues are linked, I think.
Excellent. Thank you. The another question comes from Helen Davis from University of Southampton. The presentation was mainly about encouraging participation of ecosystem services suppliers. What work done on encouraging participation of beneficiaries or buyers of ecosystem services?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Most of the work that I've come across essentially ignores the demand side of the problem. So it says, let's imagine there's a buyer, and that buyer is typically the government. But if we look at actual PES schemes, we know that the government is not the only buyer. That we've got examples in the UK of water companies who are buyers in PES schemes. We've got many examples in developing countries of environmental NGOs being the buyer. So the question is really, how do we motivate more buyers to want to buy? And there, we're thinking about, well, what benefits can they capture from the scheme? And it's very unlikely that a buyer that's not the government is going to be able to capture all of the benefits that we might think were socially important. So the water company could capture some benefits which were related to its own costs of operation, but there might be many other benefits from farmers changing their management practices which would not be captured by the water company. So I think there's an interesting issue there of firstly identifying which benefits can a given buyer capture that as economists we think should be counted from a social welfare point of view. And secondly, how do we, what kind of institutions motivate more buyers to fund these PES type schemes? Because clearly if we rely on the government to fund them all, we're going to hit the budget constraint faster than if we think about other buyers as well.
Thank you. There is another question related to transaction cost from Charlie Ganvorka from Martinique. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. What about the cost of information itself? I mean, how to avoid bargaining between institutions and trade unions for really get farmers involved in the process of at the right cost?
I'm not sure I quite understand that question.
I can repeat it. Yes, sure. How to avoid bargaining between institutions and trade unions for really get farmers involved in the process at the right cost. It's my reading is it's again how to ensure that the transaction costs are low low enough to enable cost-efficient solutions.
I think all I could say about that is that it's not always clear you want to minimize transactions costs. I mean, if we think about transactions costs, there are two kinds. One is the cost of implementing the scheme from the buyer's point of view, the government, let's say, the regulator's point of view. The other costs are the cost to the farmer of thinking about and then deciding to join the scheme. Now, the cost to the farmer of thinking about and then deciding whether or not to join the scheme, I can't think of any reason why you would want to increase those or not to reduce them. But on the other hand, from the cost to the regulator, if all you ever wanted to do was to minimize those, that would suggest you should always choose the simplest possible design of scheme. And one thing that we know for sure is that will often forego many possible net benefits. So some work I did years ago now with Paul Armsworth, we showed that even very slight complications in conservation policy design could yield very big benefits, and that would mean that it would be worth paying higher transactions costs from the perspective of the regulator to have a slightly more complicated scheme. So in our case, that was about spatially differentiated payments in order to get those net benefits. So I think when you talk about transactions costs, you really have to think very carefully about who is paying these costs. Is it the regulator or is it the land user, land manager?
Excellent. Thank you very much there. Still, I think we will limit the next question to just 3 to wrap up this webinar. So the first is from Fiona Rien Kearns, Climate Action Network. Could some kind of agglomerated payments be used as a penalty to reduce the risk of cheating where there is self-monitoring?
Yeah, so I haven't talked about this enforcement problem at all. Clearly, there's an issue for the buyer, whether it's the government or an environmental NGO or a water company, that you're essentially contracting lots of agents, so let's say 100 different farmers, to change their behavior, and you're paying them for that, but you know that you cannot completely observe all the actions of those farmers because that would be very costly for you. So there's a mechanism design problem that economists like to think about, which is, well, how do I minimize the incentive for the supply side, for the farmers in this case, to essentially, I can't think of a better word, but cheat on the bargain. And so that there's a big area of economics that looks at that issue about, well, what is it that we should do to minimize the risk of non-compliance? But I think there's this whole issue of farmers' attitudes to monitoring is slightly more complex than that mechanism design literature addresses. Certainly work we've done with forest managers, forest owners and managers in Scandinavia suggests that farmer attitudes to forest manager attitudes to compliance and monitoring are not as simple as our kind of standard models suggest, and it's not always the case that people would prefer lower levels of monitoring to check compliance.
Thank you very much. The next questions come from Hanley, University of Freiburg. Thank you for tradeable. I feel that one key issue for the implementation of the agglomeration bonus would be the definition of the optimal value of that bonus to be paid, especially relative to the fixed payment. What are your thoughts about this issue?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. There's a big issue over how high should the agglomeration bonus be, and I have no good answer to that question. In all the lab experiments we do, we clearly think about those parameter values relative to the participation payment. In the choice experiment study that I referred to with Sheramet as the lead author, we looked at, this was for forest managers in Finland. We looked at how would your stated intention to join the scheme vary according to the size of this agglomeration bonus relative to the size of the participation payment. So you could have a look at that, but I don't think I have any simple answer to your question other than to say it's important.
Thank you. And here comes the last question for which I have on today from Vince Martinet, INRA Paris. Thank you for the great presentation. In the EU context, to what extent ecosystem studies are consistent the common agriculture policies and WTO rules? Our government is reluctant to the EU in practice. does the economics, the literature emphasize on the limit payment or other than opportunity cost? What has been done in UK and all?
I had great trouble hearing what you're saying there, Yaroslav. Your sound
no problem.
breaking up.
Yeah. So the question is, to what extent, the payment for ecosystem services is compatible with EU on agriculture policy? So to what extent would you call perhaps the paying for the green component, the agriculture policies, payment to the farmer? To what extent you would call it paying for ecosystem services? And there's one comment in this question saying that the French is reluctant to employ payment for ecosystem services in practical applications. So, the second part of the question was whether the design of the scheme highlight the limits to the payment other than opportunity cost.
Okay, so I'm certainly not an expert in the subject of what kinds of design of payment scheme are compatible with EU policy. So I'm reluctant to say anything about that, other than to point out I am aware that there is this issue about under what circumstances would we want to move away from payments which were simply linked to the supply cost. So everything I have talked about, we've thought about the situation where there's variation in the cost of supply across farmers or foresters, and what we're trying to do typically is maximize environmental benefits subject to a given budget constraint. And the way we solve that problem is essentially to somehow differentiate payments across suppliers so that those with the lowest supply prices get offered less money than those with the higher supply prices. But clearly that's complicated by two factors. One is the value we place on environmental benefits is not constant across space. So should we offer higher payments in areas where, even though the supply price might be low, the marginal value from the consumer's point of view, from the taxpayer's point of view, is higher? And secondly, do we want to, in any case, think about willingness to pay as the factor which determines the most we should offer to suppliers? And that's not something that we typically do.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you who attended this webinar. This is we don't have time for any more questions, but we will send all your questions to Nick. Nick, would you like to say a few words as closing remarks?
No, just to say thank you to everyone for listening, and I hope you could hear it clearly. And if you want to get in touch with me, please do.
Thank you. So I have two announcements. The first is that the BioEcon holds an annual meeting in Cambridge in September 2018 from 12 till 14, and it's dedicated to land use, agriculture, and biodiversity, spatial and temporal issue. And the second one, our next CMCC webinar will be dedicated to valuing climate services in the cogeneration framework. The evidence is we collected in an Horizon 2020 project dedicated to climate services. It's called CLARA. It's Climate Forecast Enabled Knowledge Services that will be held next week. The presenter will be Elisa Del Piazzo from Euro-Mediterranean Center of Climate Change. Thank you again. Thank you, Nick, for excellent talk and for answering many questions. There are many more that we haven't had time to go through. Thank you again for attending this webinar, and I wish you a nice and pleasant day.